Welcome everyone to our second lecture. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're honored to have Dr. White with us to discuss the Federal Reserve and monetary policy's role in the recent stimulus. We know this is the biggest event of the evening without question. Maybe the presidential debate is a distant second, but of course this is number one. Some details for tonight. It's going to be similar to our last lecture. Dr. White's going to give a presentation, which will be followed by a Q&A. So please feel free to ask questions in the comments section as we go along. And when the Q&A begins, I'll relay them to Dr. White and he'll answer to the best of his abilities. So with the introduction, we'll introduce our guest. Dr. Lawrence White is a professor of economics here at Mason, specializing in the history and theory of money and banking. He's written multiple books on these topics, including Free Banking in Britain and Competition in Currency. He's a senior scholar at the Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives at the Cato Institute. Excuse me. He's also a senior fellow at our in-house research center, the Mercatus Center, in the F.A. Hayek program. So without further ado, Dr. White, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, James. Thanks for inviting me. So you gave me a very broad title, the role of monetary policy. So I thought I would talk specifically about what the Federal Reserve has been up to during the pandemic. A lot of people have become concerned about the degree of money printing and have begun worrying about high inflation. And I'm going to throw a little bit of cold water on that, but I'll come around to having a pessimistic view at the end for other reasons. So let me share my screen. There we go. So this is a popular meme you may have seen animated, and that is Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell turning a crank and money flying out. And in the video version, there's a heavy metal soundtrack that goes along with it. But this is a shorthand for the speed with which the Fed has been expanding the money supply in recent months. And often when the Fed expands the money supply at a rapid clip, it leads to high inflation. And so people have, other things equal, it raises the price level to have more money in circulation. But in this case, other things are not equal. The pandemic has had effects on people's willingness to spend money. So we need to consider that to answer the question of how much inflation this is going to lead to. So I hope you can see this. This is shows the size of the Federal Reserve's liabilities, or also known as the monetary base. FRED is the name of the Federal Reserve's economic database, so it's a handy place to get these kind of numbers. The shaded area represents the recession that we're currently in, and you can see that the monetary base, that's the dollar volume of the Fed's monetary liabilities, so it's bank reserves plus currency in the hands of the public. It was pretty flat up until February, and then it took off like a rocket as the Fed began a round of quantitative easing. And you can see it peaked in July, backed off a little bit, but still between February and today, it's up 39%. All right, so that's a big, so over 6 months, the monetary base has grown 39%. That's unheard of. If that carried on, we should expect to have, well, let's see, that's a half year, 39%. That's about 80% a year. We should expect to have 80% a year inflation. Again, other things equal. Another way to look at it is to look at the volume of money in the hands of the public. So for that, the M1 money stock is a narrow measure of currency and checking account balances held by the public. And that's up by basically the same proportion. Over the same 6 months, it's up 32%. And again, that's a rapid rate of money growth. In countries where you have money growing at 37% every 6 months or close to 80% a year, you would expect to see very high inflation, close to 80% inflation. But of course, we haven't had inflation yet. Here's what we have had. So this is a bar chart showing the 1 month percentage change in the consumer price index for urban consumers over the last 12 months up to August. And before the pandemic, it was 1 or 0.2% per month. And if you multiply that out, that comes out to about 2% a year, which is what the Fed aims for. But in March, we had negative inflation of 0.4%. In April, 0.8% negative. In May, still negative. And we've made up a little bit of that ground in June and July and August. So those 3 months, we have had inflation, but nothing like the magnitude you would expect given the rate of money growth. So that's a puzzle that we have to figure out. So here's another way to look at the consumer price index. Instead of the inflation rate, this is the level of the price index. And you can see it peaks in January, falls in February, March, and April, and then starts rising again. But over the last 6 months, it's up only 0.2% over the period as a whole. So we've had lower inflation over the last 6 months, despite the really high rate of monetary expansion. Now, there's a standard accounting framework for figuring out what's going to happen to the price level. And if you've taken my money in banking course or any other money in banking course, or even an introductory macro course, you should have seen this, the so-called equation of exchange, which is an identity saying that the amount of spending in the economy equals the amount of income received by people who are selling goods. So expenditures on final goods and services equals the income of people selling final goods and services. That makes sense. That's follows by definition. But we can break the two magnitudes down. So the volume of spending, we can decompose into the size of the money stock, M, multiplied by the number of times per year each dollar is spent on average. And that's the so-called velocity of money, or V. So it's the turnover rate for money in circulation. If our M measure is M1, then our velocity measure is the velocity of M1. So that would be total spending in the economy. And then that goes into purchases, and we can break the dollar volume of purchases into, or decompose it into, an index of prices and an index of quantities. So capital P is a price index like the urban CPI, and lowercase y is real income. That's the amount of stuff being sold, newly produced goods and services being sold in the economy. All right, so that's our framework. And if money is growing at 37%, but the price level is growing at less than 1%, how can that be consistent? Well, we need to look into what's happening to velocity and real income. So here are the numbers for M and P that we just saw. M1 growing 37.2% over the last 6 months, and the price index growing only 0.2%. It's easy enough to look up what's happened to real income. We're in a deep recession. Real income has fallen by a little more than 9%. It's actually rebounded a bit since the deepest drop in real income. So real income has rebounded as employment has rebounded a bit from the very bottom. But still, you can see we've got what looks like a mismatch. We've got, let's see, minus 8.9 on the right-hand side and plus 37.2 on the left-hand side. What must be happening to velocity to reconcile those two sides? Velocity must be dropping like a stone, and that's what's happened over the last 6 months. Money has stopped turning over as rapidly as it usually does. So what that means is people are hanging on to their income and not spending as much of it as they normally do. So retail spending is way down, and spending on all kinds of newly produced goods and services by business as well is way down. Government spending hasn't slowed down, but business and household spending has slowed way down. People are stockpiling money, you might say, or hoarding money, you might say. So that's why the price level hasn't risen more. Now, that's as much an accounting of it as an explanation. To explain it, we need to explain why are people stockpiling money, and there are two pretty obvious reasons. One, people are worried about their own future income. So we saw this in the financial crisis of 2008 to 2009. People also spent less out of their income and just hung on to it. They delayed their spending, especially on big ticket items, because they were concerned they might lose their job. And if you're about to lose your job, then you don't want to be buying things you will regret having bought when you can't afford groceries later on. So people let their income pile up in their bank account. We also saw that in the last recession. So one way to describe that is that the ratio of money balances that the average household holds to that household spending, or P times Y, that ratio goes up. Right? So a drop in velocity corresponds to an increase in people's money balances relative to their spending. All right, so worry about the steadiness of your own future income can lead you to cut back on spending. But in the pandemic, there's an obvious other reason that we didn't have in 2008, 2009, and that are the restrictions on getting around. So lots of shops are closed, other than supermarkets. People are doing a lot less shopping in person. They're doing a lot less dining out because restaurants were closed and only now gradually reopening with a lot less capacity indoors than they used to have. And of course, people are doing a lot less travel. The airline industry is really hurting. So for all those reasons, people have cut back on their spending. They're doing a tiny bit more online spending, but not nearly enough to make up for the reduction in spending due to the inconvenience of not being able to shop in person and not be able to find stores open. So these conditions are temporary. As the economy recovers, people's worry about their own hanging on to their job, the steadiness of their own income, that will diminish. For a lot of people, of course, it hasn't diminished, but the number of unemployed is gradually shrinking. And people whose income comes from the gig economy have started to readjust to have a better grasp of how much income they're going to have and tailor their spending to that. And stores are opening back up. Restaurants are opening back up. Travel is very slowly starting to recover. So we should expect spending to pick up again. And when spending picks up, velocity will rise. It will no longer be down 46%. It'll rise as people spend off the money balances they've now accumulated, which are giving them money balances unusually high relative to their spending. So to reestablish their normal holdings of money, people will spend off the excess. And so the Fed needs to be prepared for when spending resumes. If the money supply remains high and velocity kicks up, then we're going to have more dollar spending, and that'll drive up prices. And so if the Fed wants to avoid double-digit inflation, which they say they do, they're going to have to scale back the big increase in the money supply that they created as a policy to cushion the depth of the depression. All right, so the Fed has allowed M1 to grow, thinking that that's a way to help cushion the blow, keep people with enough liquidity to do all the spending they want to do, at least, and to keep the inflation rate from being negative. It can be argued that the Fed really has not issued enough money in the pandemic from the point of view of they've let people's dollar incomes decline, right? Real income is down 9%, and the price level has been pretty flat, which means that nominal income, dollar income, is down 9%. A different kind of Fed, instead of a Fed policy, instead of aiming at 2% inflation, which is officially their target, might aim at 2 or 4% growth in nominal spending rather than just in prices. We can get back into that toward the end. So the Fed will need to withdraw money as spending resumes, and that's going to be a very difficult problem. It's like trying to thread a needle, but trying to do it in a moving car and not directly observing the needle, but observing a video of where the needle was a minute ago, because the Fed's steering by looking in the rearview mirror. It knows where the economy was last month. And for real GDP, they only get that number quarterly. But for the price index, they get it monthly. And so even to hit a inflation target or a price level target, the Fed is trying to forecast where the price level would be if they kept their policy the same, and where it would be if they changed policy in the direction of greater expansion or greater contraction. So they're going to need to turn contractionary when spending resumes, but it's going to be very difficult for them to get the timing right. They don't have perfect foresight. Nobody does. So I'm not predicting double-digit inflation, but I wouldn't be surprised to see the Fed err in the direction of, I don't know, 5% inflation. They did that during the last recession. Or they could err in the other direction, and we could, if they tighten too much too soon, we could go back to negative inflation. So that's a difficult problem they've got. So that's the problem with monetary policy. There's a second thing the Fed has been doing besides just expanding the size of its balance sheet. It could expand the size of its balance sheet just by buying treasury bills. But instead, they've been expanding the balance sheet by buying other kinds of assets, commercial paper and corporate bonds, and by lending, something they don't normally do, lending to money market mutual funds, lending to state and local governments. That's completely new. In the last financial crisis, they provided a lending facility for money market mutual funds because they were worried about that market drying up, there not being enough liquidity. But lending to state and local governments, that's entirely different. That has nothing to do with keeping the payment system liquid. That is something that has traditionally been considered fiscal policy. Squandering the taxpayers' money is not the job of the Fed, that's the job of Congress. That's been the traditional view, and Congress ought to be accountable for it because the Congress is elected. And so if they waste the taxpayers' money, the taxpayers can hold them accountable for it. But how do you hold the Fed accountable? It's only at one very lengthy remove that the public has any say over Fed policy. That is, you elect your congressman, and your congressman can ask questions of the Fed at the Humphrey Hawkins hearings. And that's about the extent of it. So traditionally, lending to state and local governments and lending to non-financial corporations, which the Fed has also been doing, has been a function for the Congress and the US Treasury. Now, the Treasury has become involved in lending with the Fed. They've had a lending facility which has lent to large corporations, and that has dispersed hundreds of millions of dollars. They were supposed to have a facility to lend to small corporations, a so-called Main Street lending program, with the Fed making the loans, but the Treasury backstopping the loans. That is, any losses would come out of a Treasury account, not off the books of the Fed. The Fed is not supposed to make risky loans, and they traditionally haven't. Mostly they've focused on Treasury securities. In the last crisis, they started buying mortgage-backed securities, but those are relatively, not absolutely risk-free like Treasuries are, but relatively risk-free compared to state and local government bonds and bonds of non-financial corporations, which is the stuff they've been buying lately. So to absorb possible default risk on those kinds of assets, the Treasury has gotten involved. And this kind of teamwork between the Fed and Treasury is very new and really a little bit concerning, because the Fed is supposed to be independent of elected officials or of politically appointed officials like the Treasury Secretary. So mixing the two kind of mixes up the Fed's mission. The Fed's mission has traditionally been monetary policy, and that's it. They're not supposed to be involved in fiscal policy. They're not supposed to be involved in choosing which corporations get loans and which ones don't, who gets credit and who doesn't. That's a credit allocation policy. And really the market ought to handle that. But if the federal government wants to interfere with it, they should do it in a transparent way by having Congress vote a loan to, many years ago, the Chrysler Corporation, let's say, rather than have it being decided by the Fed and the Treasury. So there are two big problems with the Fed getting involved. One is the moral hazard problem that corporations now will see the Fed as a source of bailouts. And so you'll get risk-taking corporations that would be better off being wound down if they're losing money, continuing to take risks, hoping for money from the Fed or the Treasury. That's a moral hazard problem, too much risk-taking. And secondly, it risks politicizing the Fed. So if the Fed is lending to state and local governments, you would expect a heavily indebted government, like say the government of Puerto Rico, to come to the Fed and say, hey, we're heavily in debt. Why don't you lend us some money at low interest rates? That would be a big help to us. And so that they have already, in fact, lobbied the Fed. And that's not a good thing for Fed policy, to be set upon by various potential borrowers, either local or state or territorial governments, or by industrial corporations pleading with the Fed to lend them money. That wastes resources in the process of lobbying, and it leads to the Fed getting involved, as I said, in credit allocation, which is not their job. I mean, we rely on markets to allocate resources, including financial resources. We rely on financial markets, people who have their own money at risk, to decide who's a credit-worthy borrower and who isn't. Let people who are lending money bear those risks. And if the loan pays back, great. If it doesn't, they bear the cost, not the US taxpayer. So we want to avoid, I think, politicizing the Fed. Getting back to normal after this crisis is the first priority. Another issue I want to comment on, and this will lead into the long run picture, is the fiscal picture that the United States government is in, and it's not a pretty picture. So the chart on the left shows federal debt as a share of GDP. There are two measures. There's the gross debt and the net debt. This is the net debt, which is the smaller of the two. So it doesn't count Treasury bonds held by other agencies of government, like the Social Security Administration. This measure of US federal debt as a share of GDP was 77.4% as recently as fiscal year 2019. The fiscal year ends in September of the named year. It's projected to hit 98% in fiscal year 2020, which ends at the end of this month. And it's projected to go above 100% of GDP to 104.4% of GDP fiscal year 2021. So this is unprecedented indebtedness. We haven't been this indebted since World War II. And you can see from the diagram that after World War II, the ratio of debt to GDP fell pretty rapidly. The federal government ran surpluses and inflated away some of the debt, but brought the debt back down to the vicinity of 25% of GDP. Well, there's no prospect of doing that anytime soon because we've got a built-in structural deficit arising from entitlement programs, arising from Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. The deficit, because of the pandemic in fiscal year 2020, is expected to be 3.7 trillion. It used to be newsworthy when the deficit was 1 trillion. That was the new unprecedented level, unprecedented peacetime level we hit in the crisis of 2009. But now we're at 3.7 trillion, which is a staggering 19% of GDP. So if you run a deficit that's equal to 19% of GDP, then you add 19 percentage points to the ratio of debt to GDP. And that's basically the move from 77.4% to 98%. If you do the subtraction, you see it's actually 20.6%, but that's because the denominator has fallen. Actual real output has fallen. So the ratio has gone up even more than the percentage by which the debt has grown. The growth isn't expected to be another 19% in fiscal year 2021, but that depends on the economy recovering. But even if the economy recovers, this is a rather rosy Congressional Budget Office forecast. The ratio, we're expected to add another 6.4% to the debt. A 6.4% deficit is huge. I mean, it used to be that it was unusual to run a deficit of more than 4 or 5%, except in a deep recession. If the recession's over, running a deficit of 6% or more is very concerning, because in a recovery, the deficit should fall, and in a late recovery, it should actually become a surplus, so that the budget doesn't, so that the ratio of debt to GDP doesn't keep rising without limit. If it rises without limit, well, we've seen in other countries where that leads. It leads to, first, debt service, that is, the money needed to pay the interest on the debt and to roll over the maturing debt, eating up the budget. And the second chart I've got here, maybe a little hard to see, shows, the red line shows interest as a share of, interest on the debt as a share of the federal budget. And right now it's smaller than defense spending, it's smaller than other spending, it's smaller than Medicaid, but it's expected to rise and become bigger than all those things, to become something like 15% of the federal budget. And that's spending that you can't cut back on if you don't want to default on the debt. So it's a permanent kind of spending. It's locked in. And so you either have large deficits adding to the debt and adding to the future debt service. In other words, adding to future tax revenues, adding to the need for future taxes, or you raise taxes now. So if the government is overspending its tax revenue, your choice is more taxes now or more taxes later. As Milton Friedman used to argue, the burden of government is government spending. It can either be financed with present taxes or with future taxes, but it has to be financed by one or the other. Right? That burden is set by how much the government is spending. So that concerns me, because there is actually one more way to deal with rising debt service, other than raising taxes now or raising taxes later, of the ordinary sort of taxes, and that is to raise the tax on money through inflation. If the Fed runs a more inflationary monetary policy, it becomes more and more, it erodes the value in real terms, in inflation adjusted terms, of the debt held by the public. Right? Another way to, so it lowers in real terms the dollar value of the debt without changing the dollar value of the debt. So it makes it easier for the federal government to pay it off in real terms. Another way to think about that is more inflation raises people's nominal incomes, not their real incomes, just the dollar amount of incomes, not real because prices are rising at the same rate. So it raises the federal government's nominal tax revenue in dollars. Right? If everybody's income goes up, then the income tax will rake in more dollars, even if it's the same percentage of their incomes. More tax revenue relative to the dollar amount of the debt, because the dollar amount of the debt doesn't change right away because of inflation. If the Treasury owes $20 trillion, it owes $20 trillion. It's only as high inflation starts to get reflected in the interest rate at which the Treasury borrows that it starts rolling into the size of the debt. So that's a problem going forward. It becomes tempting to inflate the more indebted the federal government becomes. And we've seen other countries go down that path where if they can't constrain their fiscal deficits, then they can't avoid the temptation to use more inflation, and you get chronic inflation. And in a way, that's how we eliminated a lot of the debt that the United States government had from World War II. The price level rose quite substantially between World War II and, let's say, 1970, and that was responsible for eroding about half of the debt in real terms. So that's a danger. I mean, that period was marked by not 2% inflation, but an average of something like 5% inflation, and at the worst, it was double-digit inflation. So we don't want to repeat that. So how do we avoid these high chronic deficits and rising debt giving the Fed too much temptation to inflate? We have to restrain either fiscal policy or monetary policy. So we would need, if we wanted to do that, either a fiscal rule that says growth in the ratio of federal debt to GDP cannot be greater than, let's say, the average rate of growth of the economy. That would make sure that the ratio didn't rise relative to GDP. The debt didn't rise faster than GDP. So over the last 10 years, real income has grown about 2%. So don't let the real debt rise more than 2% a year. That would be a fiscal rule. Other kinds of fiscal rules would be a spending limitation or a tax limitation. I think spending limitation is more effective, but a debt ratio limitation is another option. Or we need a monetary rule. A monetary rule says the Fed has to follow the following formula for issuing money. So they don't have the discretion to issue money at whatever rate they want to, as they've been doing in the pandemic. So it can be made contingent on what's happening in the economy, but it can't just be whatever the Fed wants. It needs to be something that rules out inflation to wash away, erode away the debt at the expense of money holders. Okay, well, those are my thoughts. Let me open it up for Q&A.
All right, thank you, Professor. We actually have the first question is, I think, a clarification on the last point you meant. Curtis is asking, is that devaluation of the debt through inflation, is that what people mean when they use the term monetizing the debt?
Yeah, well, it's related. Monetizing the debt refers to printing money in order to buy the debt that the Treasury is issuing, so that it doesn't go into the financial market and push up interest rates on US government debt. So if the Fed buys it, it kind of sequesters it. And so the Treasury doesn't as quickly saturate the market, you might say. And during the last 6 months, the Fed has bought a very large share of the debt the Treasury's been issuing, with the huge deficit that I mentioned, 3 point some trillion dollars, the Fed has monetized. If we go back to the chart and look at how much the monetary base has grown, they've monetized about half of that.
Mm.
The term depreciation is usually used in the context of exchange rates. A country with high inflation is going to have a falling exchange rate or a depreciating currency.
Okay. I actually have a question. You talked about how consumer prices, you're not seeing, like double-digit inflation in consumer prices. But I was wondering, since the Fed is dumping like a large quantity of money into financial markets and treasury bonds, mortgage-backed securities, are we seeing like a lot of inflation in financial markets, maybe relative to consumer prices?
That's a good point. Yes, we are. Of course, the stock market has been surprising everyone by how well it's been doing in the midst of a 9% drop in real output. And partly that's because the ultra low interest rates and the money being pumped in give people with excess money, well, where do you put it? If you put it in the bank or if you buy bonds, you hardly get any return, right? Treasury bonds are paying a fraction of 1%. Short-term bonds are paying less than 1/10 of 1%. So if you want a little bit more yield, put it in the stock market. That's going to buoy the stock prices. And I think we've seen some of that. In the previous round of expansionary monetary policy before 2007, we saw it go into house prices. And there again, the Fed wasn't paying attention because their 2% inflation target is geared to either the CPI or a different consumer inflation index, the consumer price, what's it called? Consumer expenditure inflation rate. So I think we've seen house prices begin to come back up too. I can't give you the number on that. I haven't paid that close attention to it, but raw material prices are also buoyant. Gold hit $2,000 a little while ago. So yeah, all that suggests that there's a lot of money sloshing around financial markets, raising prices there, if not so much in consumer markets.
Right. We have a question here from Pedro. Doesn't focusing on the debt to GDP ratio already give the government too much room to expand its size, which will in the end become unsustainable anyways?
Well, it's true that it doesn't put a limit on the size of government relative to GDP. A spending limitation, a fiscal rule in the form of a spending limitation would do that. So you could state it as an absolute amount, and that would make the government shrink as the economy grew, or you could state it in percentage terms, and that would keep the economy from growing any faster than the government budget from growing any faster than the economy grows. And if you think the people determining the Congress and the administration officials who come up with the federal budget respond to incentives, then maybe you want to give them some incentive to let the economy grow. But yeah, I mean, I haven't commented on the size of the federal government relative to where I would like it to be, but
Yeah. That's for the next lecture.
Yeah. That would be a fiscal policy lecture, but yeah, I think it's too large. The federal government's doing all kinds of things that it would be better off not doing.
All right. Another question. We've seen the Fed is kind of trying to like do long run averages for their inflation target, right? Or they're trying to do like, oh, well, we didn't hit 2% inflation, our
Right.
original goal for the last couple of years. So we're going to do it in the long term. Do you think that could really come back and bite us when maybe expenditures pick up again and maybe consumer prices start to rise on top of the Fed trying to get even more inflation going?
So I'm not against average inflation targeting in principle, because if the Fed makes a mistake on either the low side or the high side, it does make sense to make up for it in order to make the price level in the long range more predictable. So think of the Fed having a target, which is a path for the price level, and let's say it rises 2% each year. If they undershoot it, they can either try to catch back up, and if they catch back up, then you know where the price level is going to be in the future. If they say, no, we're going to wipe the slate clean and aim for 2% from here on out, you don't know where the price level is going to be in the future, because if they miss it again, they may restart all over again at some other number. So it helps keep the Fed more accountable and helps make the price level more predictable if they do average inflation targeting. Now, the Fed hasn't told us over what period they're going to average the inflation. So they haven't told us at what point they expect to re-hit the path that they have undershot. If they were more explicit about that, that would help even more people form expectations about where the price level is going to be, and therefore about what interest rates they should be willing to pay, what interest rates borrowers should be willing to lend at, given what's going to happen to the purchasing power of the dollar they're repaid in. But I would prefer, as long as we have a Fed and it operates by setting these kind of targets, we have a Fed with fiat money, and it operates by setting these kind of targets, to have a nominal income target rather than a price level target. I think that would help the Fed respond more appropriately to real shocks that hit the economy. And the COVID-19 crisis is very much a real shock. I mean, businesses have shut down, people have been unemployed because they can't go to work because factories have been shut down. All that very much restricts the real output of the economy.
I'd imagine.
And so prices rising in that kind of situation actually gives us some useful information. And it's kind of pointless or silly to try to keep the average level of prices rising by restricting monetary policy so that other prices don't rise as much.
Right. I would imagine that since the lockdown is in place, or even though they're kind of coming off of it, that there's going to be a lot more constraints on GDP growth than maybe, in the recession, what was it, in 2008? Do you think that's a major concern for like rising debt, getting to a point where it's out of control? The fact that we could have long-term shutdown?
Yeah, in both ways. One, it's going to mean less tax revenue as the economy recovers slowly because factories aren't reopening and entertainment businesses aren't getting back to normal. And so that's going to make the deficit bigger and the debt grow faster. And it's going to mean more government spending. They keep talking about, let's have an additional so-called stimulus bill. And so you get these unprecedented levels of emergency spending, some of which is going to, bail out corporations that really don't need or shouldn't be bailed out. The economy is going to have to readjust to new conditions.
Right. All right. Looks like that's all the questions we have. Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time tonight, Professor. If anyone else is interested in learning a lot more than what was covered tonight, you can take Dr. White's Money and Banking course, 310, in the spring.
If you're a GMU student.
Yes, if you're a Mason student. But yeah, otherwise, thank you so much again. And
my pleasure.
We'll keep you updated on future events. Thank you very much.
Okay, everybody subscribe.